Hello, everyone. I'm so grateful that everybody has come here tonight to join this conversation about NATO. I think it's really important that we dive into this discussion today, given all of the news and information and debate that's going on among Democrats and Republicans, but specifically Republicans, about the future of NATO. As many of you know, the Vandenberg Coalition is named after Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who himself was very instrumental in the creation of multiple different multilateral organizations to include NATO itself, which was created at the onset of the Cold War to insulate the United States and Western Europe from Soviet aggression. And over the course of the next 40 years, NATO has played a very critical role in helping the United States contain and deter adversaries and frankly, ultimately win that Cold War. But today, the United States is contending with new threats, including the rise of the Communist Party of China, and conservatives are increasingly divided about whether NATO itself is a worthwhile investment. Supporters argue that the alliance remains a valuable deterrent against Russia seeking to reconstitute its former power, but skeptics are arguing that Europe has been free riding off American military power for far too long while no longer providing the same strategic value given the rise of these other adversaries like China. So this debate has really intensified, and we've seen it specifically in the Vandenberg Coalition. We are a coalition of people that tends to believe in the transatlantic relationship. But we've seen over the last few weeks an increase in the debate among even our advisory board members, questioning what kind of role and relationship we should have with NATO going forward. And this is why we decided to host this discussion. It's not a debate, it's a discussion about where we see NATO today and where we can see NATO going into the future. So I am really honored to be joined by our guests tonight, and I'm sure most of you already know them, follow their work. But each of them has written and spoken about the benefits and shortcomings of NATO. So I'll introduce them quickly, and then we will get into the discussion. Immediately to my left is Bradley Bowman, who serves as a senior director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a great partner organization to the Vandenberg Coalition. And he promotes understanding of the defense strategies, policies, and capabilities necessary to deter and defeat threats to the United States and our allies. He previously served as a national security advisor on Capitol Hill to Senators Kelly Ayotte and Todd Young, as an active duty U.S. Army officer, including as company commander and a Black Hawk pilot in command, and as an assistant professor at West Point. Next to him, we have Marshall Billingslea, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, also a wonderful partner organization to the Vandenberg Coalition, who focuses on illicit finance and arms control with the Kleptocracy Initiative. He previously served as Special Presidential Envoy for Arms Control at the U.S. Department of State, where he led arms control negotiations and worked with partners and allies in Europe and Asia on the development and deployment of defensive capabilities. He has also served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary General of NATO for Defense Investment, and Chairman of NATO's C3 Board. And then finally, we have Danielle Pletka, who is a Distinguished Senior Fellow in Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at AEI, yet another amazing partner organization of the Vandenberg Coalition, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East, and terrorism. And she also teaches U.S. Middle East policy at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, is a political analyst for NBC News, and is the co-host of the podcast What the Hell is Going On alongside Mark Thiessen. They also did a great episode actually on the future of NATO with Secretary General Rutte recently that everybody should listen in on. She also previously served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Okay, so with those introductions of really spectacular panelists, we're going to get into the discussion. And I do want to just start with some level setting questions first. So I think we all agree on these up front. So I'm going to ask the question. You tell me if you agree or disagree. All of you agree that NATO was enormously important and successful in helping the United States win the Cold War. Yes? Yes. Full agreement. All of you agree at present there are things about NATO that probably require some fixing. Yes. Okay. And all of you agree that the most disappointing leader of NATO right now is Pedro Sanchez. No, we got to know. But we have two other yeses, three yeses, including me. Maybe we'll get into that one. I think we're going to start out with Danny, because the idea for this discussion actually was sparked in part by a Substack that you wrote, where you said, and I'm going to quote you, "Slowly, with regret and even dread, I'm coming around to the view that it is time for America to reconsider whether it still serves our interests to base thousands of troops in Western Europe. More than 100 years after we first raced in to defeat shared enemies in World War I, perhaps it's time for Europe to stand or fall on its own." So I want to start with you. Have we run out of time to fix NATO?
Thank you, Carrie. And thank you to the Vandenberg team and my colleagues. We're three old Hill people you've got here, so we actually have a lot in common, except for Pedro Sanchez, apparently.
That was deliberately provocative.
Yeah, I know. We're all going to want to talk about that because I'm not sure I understand. Look, I wrote that piece not because the president has been signaling for many years now that he has hesitation about the transatlantic alliance, because I think his fundamental instinct about this is actually wrong, right? He questions these sort of permanent alliances, and it's not wrong to question them. I think he questions the premise. But of course, the problem for all of us is that Europe has made this easy for him. Right, that this is the challenge. But if I can just step back for a second, Carrie, one of the things that I think is very much worth talking about for all of us, especially the nerds among us at think tanks, is the fact that a lot of these organizations that were built in the wake of World War II were created in a very different world and in a very different spirit. And they haven't been rethought for good or for ill. We have the same problem with the United Nations. Right? We have the same problem in many ways with the European Union. All of these organizations are one-way ratchets. You come in, but you never leave. It's the Hotel California of international organizations. For example, I know that many of our colleagues have written extensively on the question of why the hell Turkey is still in NATO, right? Turkey, which works very hard at looking like an adversary rather than an ally. And so these are sort of the factors that deserve honest conversation. It's not just, as the president likes to say, what they all owe us. It is the fact that these countries have gotten used to being free riders because so much obeisance to the NATO idea is just that. It's piety masquerading as policy. And those things deserve an open discussion about whether this is an alliance. For us, it has been. Right? We commit the money, we commit the forces, we commit the lift, we commit the not enough ammo, as we were just discussing a moment ago, and the Europeans. Yes, they contribute a lot, but old Europe, and I hate quoting Don Rumsfeld just because Mark does it all the time, and I hate doing it, but old Europe doesn't do enough. And if there's a group that has been undermining the foundations of the transatlantic alliance, it's not the Republican Party, right? It's our NATO allies in Europe. So that was a really long introduction, and I'll shut up now.
No, it's a great starting point, and it sort of brings me to Marshall, because you had an ex post earlier this year where you said, when you hear people talking about the U.S. walking away from NATO, let's be really clear on what that means. And I think we frequently focus on the areas where maybe we haven't seen a match in our expectations. But in other ways, the world that we would live in today would look very different without the NATO alliance, including for U.S. security. So I'd love to hear why it is you think we'd be giving up more than we can afford if we were to decide to walk away.
Yeah, Danny, I just am going to have to disagree with you on this idea that NATO is trapped in an inertia of its own making. I went to NATO at Don Rumsfeld's request to become the Assistant Secretary General after 9/11. And we propelled the alliance into a radical shift from a territorial defense-focused set of forces to expeditionary forces that were prepared to go and fight with us in Afghanistan. And while I do think Pedro is currently the worst head of state that we've had to deal with, they come and go. Back then, after 9/11, it was the Spanish the Spanish helicopter battalion that was flying me around Afghanistan. We actually lost one of those helicopters shortly after I left Afghanistan to a mishap. But the Spanish were there on the front lines. And let's be very clear, the front lines were everywhere. There was a 360-degree battle space, and every single NATO country that put troops on the ground as part of a provincial reconstruction team was in the fight. No question. The alliance reinvented itself. We strong-armed the French into setting up a training mission in Iraq for commissioned officers, and so on and so on and so forth. One of the things I realized at NATO is that the world hates it when the United States leads. It really hates it when we don't. And so for NATO, and I have one other point, but I think we need to clean up our terminology here. NATO is an alliance. It is a meeting mechanism among nations to coordinate on things such as the whole reason we can whine about not having enough ammunition is because we actually have NATO standards for ammunition. The 155 millimeter howitzer round is a NATO standard. The 7.62 cartridge is a NATO standard. All of the identification friend and foe data links that we use to communicate between multinational aircraft, the way we are able to be interoperable with countries is because of these NATO standards. And so that's NATO. What we're really talking about is we're talking about a fifth of the alliance, old Europe, who are absolute deadbeats, who have been free riding on the coattails of the United States for far too long. I have specific recommendations on what I'd like to see done to them. We'll get to that. But I want to separate, again, the deadbeats from the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Poles, the Romanians, the Finns, who are all meeting their defense obligations. The Latvians are actually spending 5% on core defense, not 3.5, not 2, but 5% this year.
Can I quickly just ask, why it does seem that there is this sort of clear distinction in my mind, and maybe it's not quite as categorical as this, but between what I would call maybe Eastern Europe NATO and Western Europe NATO. What's the root of that? Is it that
it's Russia?
Right. They understand
Proximity to the bear.
Yeah.
It's Russia. They get it, and the Italians and the Spanish and the French, they're very happy, but sitting,
Yeah.
Eastern Europe is the landmine
right.
for Western Europe.
And so, Brad, on that point, you had written something shortly after the national security strategy came out, where you said, whereas the first Trump administration's NSS identified Russia's desire to weaken the credibility of America's commitment to Europe, the 2025 NSS does that all on its own by describing the viability of NATO as an open question. So I'd love to hear from you sort of two questions. One, at what point do you, because, obviously we're not just a partner to NATO because we always have been. There's moments where we can sort of question the viability of existing arrangements, but why are we not at that point for NATO, from your perspective?
Thanks. I think serious national security folks need to constantly reassess and address assumptions and to make sure that your old assumptions and policies still make sense. I do that on a weekly/daily basis, and here's where I land. From a moral, strategic, and philosophy standpoint, NATO is a major grand strategic asset for the United States, and undermining it or leaving it would be a grand strategic unforced error for the United States and a gift of Vladimir Putin and a gift to the Chinese Communist Party, full stop. I said moral. I'm an Afghanistan veteran. Those of you, most everyone in the room is old enough to remember 9/11, right? Remember, we were attacked. They weren't. Article 5. And then they went and fought and died with us for 20 years. More than 1,000 of our European and Canadian allies never returned home to their families. They're empty kitchen tables. And when I hear Americans in Washington speaking flippantly and disrespectfully about our NATO allies, I pray, I'm a person of faith, I pray to God that the parents of those people don't hear them talking, because I think it's so fundamentally disrespectful to them. And let me remind you, when we had the Abbey Gate attack, remember the Abbey Gate attack? Do you know who was in the hospital treating those American casualties, the corpses of the Americans killed? Europeans. So, anyone who speaks that way to our European allies, I just don't frankly have any time for them from a moral perspective. And from a strategic perspective, I'm finishing a 2-year project that I'm leading at FDD called Axis of Aggressors with my colleague Elaine Dzinski and Rear Admiral retired Mark Montgomery. We're looking at all 4 members of the Axis, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. We're looking at all 6 bilateral relationships. We're looking at through the lens of not just economic, financial, cyber, technology, and military. And after that 2-year project, I got to tell you, and I've got 616 data points unclassified across 5 categories of security cooperation to tell you that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea appreciate the value as partners, and we should too. The bullies are coming around the corner, folks. This might be a 1939, 1940 moment. I don't know. You lose cool points in think tank land if you say the sky's falling. I don't care. I'm at the point in my life where I'm wondering where we were in 1939, 1940 moment. This is a good time to have friends when the bullies are coming around a corner. It's a better time to have friends with muscles who know how to throw punches. We need NATO. We need them more than ever. We're powerful. But if you didn't learn in 2024 in the Red Sea and you didn't learn during the 40-day war that America's pretty awesome, but we're not that awesome, and when things are kind of harder than they look and you need a little help, then you need to wake up and read the news and leave the American arrogance at the door. And if you only care about China and that's the only thing you care about, one, I think you're foolish, because you can't be squishy on Iran and not be a hawk on Iran. And you can't be squishy on Russia, because you don't understand that Russia's giving targeting information to Iran and I give you like 50 more examples where it makes no sense to be squishy on them. So we need this alliance. We undermine it at our own peril and a gift of Vladimir Putin. So that's where I come down. Thanks.
Well, and Brad, your argument is very similar to what Senator Vandenberg's argument was when he created NATO, which was NATO and the United Nations and all of these different entities were created not as a form of charity or the United States, seeing this utopian vision, but really as an understanding that they were these insulating layers to protect U.S. national security going forward.
Can I do a 30-second addendum? I said moral, strategic, ideology. I got a little carried away and I forgot the last one. Forgive me. I get excited about these things. I care. Forgive me. Sorry. Too much caffeine. Ideology. The Republican Party used to be a conservative party. I'd say it's probably not a conservative party anymore because leaning on philosophers and smarter than me. The essence of a conservative is someone through a study of human nature and history understands that it's easier to destroy than to build, and you better be real careful what you destroy, because once it's gone, you're going to miss it. Oh, what are those institutions, norms, and mores you don't want to destroy? I don't know. The Constitution might be one. Alliances that you depend on, norms, these sorts of things. So, the Republican Party, last time I checked, is a political party and not a cult. It's okay to say the leader's wrong sometimes. In this case, hey, I don't like what Spain's doing. You know who the most problematic leader of NATO right now is? Donald Trump. Why? You say, ooh, whoa, man, you just said that. Didn't you work for 3 Republican senators? Yeah, I did. But, let's call balls and strikes regardless of pitching. What the Spanish leader does, okay, that's annoying. We can roll around that. Have you heard about the naval base in Rota, Spain? Have you heard about 4 destroyers that protect Israel and U.S. service members based in Rota, Spain? The most problematic leader is Donald Trump, because he's undermined deterrence, which is a perception of our adversaries, looking at you, Vladimir Putin, of our political will and our military capability. By suggesting we won't back Article 5, we've increased the chances of a Crimea-style invasion of the Baltics in the next 2 to 4 years.
So I want to dive deeper into this question, because I think this is sort of the root of it, right? Is this idea that NATO is both a military alliance, but it's also there because of shared values between the United States and Europe. And today there seems to be a real question on sort of both sides of the Atlantic whether or not there really are still those shared values. So, for example, the Europeans will point to what you're pointing to, Brad, which is President Trump not forcefully condemning Putin's invasion of Ukraine and, of course, threatening to take Greenland. Conservatives here in the United States are concerned about backsliding in different European countries on fundamental freedoms, religious liberty, freedom of speech, et cetera, as well as the rise in anti-Semitism, cozying up to the Chinese Communist Party. So this is a question for all of you. Maybe we'll start with Danny and go down. Do you believe on a fundamental level that the United States and NATO allies are still aligned on these fundamental values, and how important is maintaining or restoring that alignment to long-term success of the alliance?
That's a great question. And a very hard one to answer. I come at these things, so as you can all tell, I have lots of opinions, but not 616 factoids, unfortunately. But I come at this as a Middle East expert, first and foremost. So let me just say that as a Middle East expert and as a Jew, I find it very difficult to argue that much of Europe shares my values and my morals as an American. But perhaps better times are ahead for us. I guess the challenge for all of us is that because we subscribe to the pieties about NATO, and we enjoy implying that people who don't any longer because of a lot of empirical facts about the investment that particularly Western Europe, and I think so much of this I agree wholeheartedly with what Marshall said, which is that we cannot fault our allies in I prefer New Europe than Eastern Europe. It seems to imply some sort of Warsaw Pact, and in fact they are one of us. The question really is no longer whether the Latvians, Lithuanians, the Estonians, and Romanians are Western allies, because I think they are. The question is whether the Spains, the Frances, the UKs, and others are in fact Western allies. I'm leaving Italy out a little bit just because I'm sentimental, not for any actual factual reason. So these are really, really hard things. The problem is, if I can, and I can't believe I'm doing this twice, Mark will be so proud, Don Rumsfeld used to rudely say, NATO, keep the myth alive. Remember that one? Our friend, who shared that with us. And that's a nasty sentiment, but it was based on the fact that there were these disagreements about investment. There were these disagreements about choices that the United States made. Yes, of course, on the ground, one of the things I love to see is that at a mill level, which is what so much of what we're talking about, these guys are with us. I'm not even worried about the Italian military, watching its predecessors in the glass-bottom boats. It's the political leaders. And unfortunately, it's not just the political leaders. It's the populations of these countries. Because, after decades and decades of being led by the kinds of people they are, after decades and decades of being educated in the system that they are, after decades and decades of abnegation about what their countries stand for, and that I can speak to with great experience, you have populations that don't believe in this alliance, that do hate America. Okay? And those things are important. And if we don't discuss them frankly and openly, then people like us, and I've used that term advisedly, people like us are not going to win this fight. Right? That's the problem. We need to why do we never talk about Turkey? When was the last time there was a conversation about Turkey inside NATO? Never. Right? About Turkey buying S-400s. Right? About Turkey supporting the Iranians. About Turkey housing Hamas. Are those shared values? We don't even have to talk about Pedro Sanchez. But the idea that Donald Trump is somehow worse than Recep Tayyip Erdogan, that's a hard one for me. I'll be frank. I think these kinds of conversations are critically important because I don't want to cast aspersions on people I know hate Vladimir Putin, want to stand with Ukraine, want to stand with our allies, want to do more, but aren't getting the help that they need. And if we don't frankly admit those things and we don't bully our allies in the way that we have, I don't think we get where we need. Oh, and by the way, they were awful on Iran. I'm sorry. We can't just ignore it. And yes, everybody has stepped up after the performative BS. Everybody, even the Spanish, right? But the performative BS is exactly what got broadcast to their populations and to ours. That matters. So there's my pitch.
I'm going to go to Brad before I go to Marshall, just to sort of respond to some of what Dandy said. And also this question of, do you feel that there is still sort of enough of a shared values between us and our European partners?
Well, I think it might, to those of you who are, realpolitik, you love realist theory in grad school, that whole thing, the whole idea of values might seem shocking to you, but I bring a huge value moral lens to foreign policy because that's just maybe who says more about me than anything else. But how many of you have read the preamble to the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty that was signed on Constitution Avenue? Have you read it recently? You probably have. Thank you for your honesty, sir. Here's part of it. Founded on the principles of, this is from the preamble of the North Atlantic Treaty. Founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. Check, check, check. I like all three of those. They seek to promote stability and well-being in the North Atlantic area. They are resolved to unite their efforts for its collective defense and for the protection of peace and security. So values, principles of democracy, individual rule of law. Has every European country lived up to that? Have some of them like really, really sucked at that? Yes. Are there major problems? Was I a leading voice arguing that Turkey should be evicted from the F-35 program when you procure an air defense system from the leading threat? Yes, I was. No one's been silent on Turkey, ma'am. Not at all. And you can say, here's the point, right? Isn't this kind of what we're dancing around? And I'm not saying this is your position, but if we say that they need to be like perfect or aligned with us on everything, that seems like a ridiculous straw man. So we have a whole lot of Republicans and supposed conservatives saying we should trash NATO because of all the problems. How about we at least mention some of the things in the asset column, right? Isn't that what a fair and objective assessment would be? So talk about problems. Hello, Viktor Orban. There's a problem, right? There's a problem. Are we afraid to say that? Viktor Orban's a friend of Putin. Can we say that among Republicans? Hello, there's a problem. Erdogan, amen. You and I agree on everything about Turkey. Turkey's a major problem. I think we should change the definition of QME to include Turkey. Because, I really do. So I'm with you. But just because there's major problems, just because we don't like one of the leaders says, do we trash one of the most successful strategic alliances in history? And help the Europeans step up to do more on the European continent so we can do more in the Middle East and more in the First Island chain? Of course we do. So, this reminds me a little bit of the debate about the disastrous Iran nuclear agreement, right? Do you fix it or do you throw it out? I am in the fix, not that there's that many problems. I am in the reform. Don't throw out your best asset you have in foreign policy.
Marshall, same question to you. Do you think there's shared values? And then maybe I'll follow it up with another question for you, which is I'd love for us to get into what those solutions can look like. What are the forms that we want to see in NATO? So both of those questions over to you to start.
I don't know that there are as strong a set of shared values uniformly across the U.S., Europe, and Canada as there used to be. And part of this has to do with the fact that substantial parts of Western Europe have been colonized. And you see this with the anti-Semitism, you see this with the pro-Palestinian violent demonstrations, you see this with the intimidation prayers. It's happening here in the U.S. too, but it is a huge issue. I don't know that we necessarily share the same values of free speech. And while the vice president sort of attacked on this issue early in the administration in a way that caused a reaction, he put his finger on a major issue, which is we have certain countries like the United Kingdom who are suppressing free speech, and that's unacceptable. Again, there is a geographic divide here between the countries that have had substantial influx of populations from North Africa and the Middle East versus those who have not. What really concerned me about the behavior of Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom, and France with the Iran contingency is that it also suggests that they can quite conveniently overlook shared interests. It's in all of our interests that Iran not possess a nuclear weapon, to deny the United States overflight, to deny the United States use of a base that we have poured hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in. I mean, I was just looking at Spain. Spain, do you know, in the last 3 years, Spain is pulling out around $800 million for improvements at Rota. Spain only pays 5% of that budget. We pay just under 15%. Germany pays the identical amount that we pay. That's unacceptable. Now, but NATO does need fixing, and there need to be consequences for the deadbeats. And what I've laid out are 4 specific things. The first is, and these are things that are achievable. They're achievable by the current NATO Secretary General in some respects, and they're going to take a little bit of work in some other cases. But the NATO Secretary General is empowered to make decisions on personnel staffing in the international staff, like the Assistant Secretary Generals. No country that is failing to hit 2%, soon to be 3.5%, should have any official at the Deputy Assistant Secretary General level or higher. The same goes for the international military staff, which the chairman of the military committee can control. You should not have a general officer or a flag officer in the integrated command structure if you're not hitting 2%, and soon to be 3.5%. Just simple facts. One that'll take a little more work is why would a country like Spain get a vote in the NATO budget committees, right? Why do they get a veto in the silence procedure? It's a unanimous process. Countries that fail to hit their spending targets should be moved to observer status in the budget committees. And then this one will drive them nuts. This one will absolutely drive them nuts. But the Secretary General should only call on ambassadors at the North Atlantic Council from deadbeat countries last in meetings of the council sessions. Make them sit, make them wait. By the time Spanish ambassador gets up to talk, Christian's counterpart, Christian himself soon will have long departed and left the third secretary from the Estonian ministry sitting there in the chair to listen to the Spanish blather. But if you know anything about European diplomats, other than the very taciturn Nordics, they like to talk. Make them wait.
Brad, what do you think about these reforms and any others that you would add?
I think Marshall brings tremendous experience. I respect it, and those all sound smart to me. I mean, don't misunderstand me. I'm obviously being overly dramatic for dramatic effect here this evening, but and there certainly are problems, and I think you've identified some really practical solutions. When you fail to meet some of your commitments, there should be consequences. I mean, that's like a rule of basic parenting, and it kind of works in NATO as well. And the 3.5%, right? That's a goal for 2035, right? FYI, America's not reaching 3.5%, and we've been barely above 3%. And little factoid for you, building on my 1939 comment, for 3 years before 9/11, the last time we spent this little on defense as a percentage of GDP was 1940, 1 year before Pearl Harbor, just so you know. So I don't know, another rule of parenting, when you tell your kids to do something, maybe you should do it yourself. So if we're going to beat up on people to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense, maybe we should do that too. Oh, and here's one more in terms of walk your talk. If you can talk about freedom of the press, maybe we shouldn't try to squelch media on here where we don't like what they're saying, because that might be downright not conservative to do that.
And Marshall, just to follow up on some of these reforms that you've proposed, are there mechanisms within NATO currently to accomplish these reforms? Is there a real pathway to do them?
Well, the first two, it's within the unilateral authority of the Secretary General to decide who gets promoted on the international staff. He can simply make that crystal clear. We could, obviously, by withholding funds, we could incentivize those right decisions to be made if we had to.
Okay.
The Budget Committee decisions to move people into observer status, that's a little more tricky. But it's not inconceivable, and certainly the naming and shaming, which countries hate, which would be part of this process, would have value. Just the process of trying to achieve that alone, I think, would have value.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question it'll be the same question for everybody, and then we're going to turn to questions from the audience because I want to make sure that we have ample time to hear their questions. This is really thinking about the future of the next few decades. Does the United States' relationship with NATO need to evolve in light of the China threat? And if so, what are the sorts of things that we should be looking for or asking as it relates to partnering with NATO to counter China? Maybe Danny, we'll start with you.
I mean, this is an object of huge contention between the United States and Europe. And, we can go back endlessly. Did everybody notice that Vladimir Putin suggested that Gerhard Schroeder be the negotiator for us on Ukraine, which the Trump administration said no thank you to? I was happy to see. I feel like that's kind of where we are on China as well, which is that there's sort of a slow dawning recognition, but that the fights that our friend John Kyle had up on Capitol Hill about keeping Huawei and ZTE out, and the unbelievably unpleasant bilats we had with our allies on this were sort of the beginning, and I don't think Europe has really woken up in a serious way yet. If you look around and see the nature of European cooperation with China, I'll just pick two countries that I know a great deal about. What I see in Italy is there are Chinese police stations, right, in Prato, where there's a significant Chinese population, right? There's Chinese enforcement. There's Chinese immigration enforcement in Italy. In Serbia, obviously, we see the Chinese control vast areas of the state infrastructure, including surveillance, right? So companies that we have sanctioned for their role in Uyghur concentration camps, for example, are doing happy business with our European allied governments, and it's a form of suicide. There's no other way to describe it. But unfortunately, and obviously the clarity coming from President Trump on this is, how should I say it? Terrible. He has a very different view of how such things work, and the departure of someone like Matt Pottinger from the first administration and the presence now of anti-Matt Pottingers in the second administration, and people who really don't understand. I would say even more, less problematic than that they are bad, than they simply do not understand, right? People who think IEPA is a way to impose tariffs, those kind of people. This is really the problem. So the whole concept of friendshoring, the whole concept of, for example, recreating COCOM in order to crowd out or diversify away from China and India and China's cutouts, right, is just, it's nowhere. And all of our think tanks have done great work in this space. Derek Scissors, my colleague at AEI, is a ranting psychopath on this topic. And we are not having a lot of impact in the United States. In Europe, they are 10 steps behind us and not advancing. And, when we talk about NATO being, undermining NATO being a gift to the Chinese, when you look at the sort of the Bridge Colby Quincy Institute perspective, I think that's right, because of course it's undermining NATO, but not actually doing anything about China, walking away from China as well. It's just isolationism. But the reality is that it is our weakness that is tempting China, not actually our rhetoric.
Marshall, how do you see NATO fitting into a sort of future conflict with China?
I don't see NATO itself, again, because it's a North Atlantic focused organization. Things could change, but I do see key NATO allies that we will want to have with us in the event of a crisis over Taiwan. We have key NATO allies that we want to see assert freedom of navigation maneuvers. The Germans have done it in the Strait not too long ago. The French, the Brits, others. So the seafaring nations, including nations with actual territories and interests in Asia, we will want to work with them to make sure that they bring complementary capabilities and that we are talking to them well in advance of an actual emerging crisis. I think more broadly with regard to China, we ourselves have been a little muddled in terms of how we are thinking about communist China today. And it makes it therefore a little difficult to hector key countries. There are flashes of inspiration. There are flashes of clarity. The Lithuanians, although they're starting to walk it back a bit, the Lithuanians moved out pretty decisively against China and in favor of creating basically a Taiwan relations office there. We want to encourage that, but as a final point, it takes statesmanship. Okay. There's a reason why a communist who runs a minority government in Madrid traipses off to China to try to get trade deals. It's because he's trying to ensure his political survival by cheap and easy access to goods. So we have to work on that, and we have to identify the statesmen and stateswomen in Europe when they come to power and encourage them to make the right decisions. And we ourselves have to make the right decisions as well.
Brad, same question to you.
Yeah, I believe China is the number one threat Americans confront. I believe, like the Soviet Union, it has a hostile ideology. Like the Soviet Union, it has a very impressive and increasingly impressive military. unlike the Soviet Union, it has a far larger economy that's far more integrated in the global economy. So, I'm not a historian, I don't pretend to be, but, based on those three things I just said, I'm more concerned. I'm old enough to remember the tail end of the Cold War. I'm more concerned about China than than the Soviet Union was back in the day. And then when you combine that to what I've said and what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified to the Senate Armed Services Committee in June of last year, we're seeing unprecedented cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. My words now, making each of them more capable or resilient in their ongoing or respective spheres of aggression, calling into question longstanding assumptions about the military capability and capacity we need. That's fancy Washington language, but I think you know what I mean by that. So if I'm putting together a grand strategy, which you can read in chapter 7 and 8 of our forthcoming book on acts of aggressors, I need NATO to be unified and strong. I, as a selfish American, want NATO to be unified and strong so that they can take the lead on deterring additional Russian aggression in Europe, so we can do more in Europe to deter the worst war of the 21st century in the first island chain. And in addition to the Europeans doing more, and what does that mean? Defense spending, honoring your defense spending commitments, build your own arsenal, build your production capacity, build your arsenals, build your ability to help Ukraine even more than you already have, and make sure you're unified with the United States of America in all things economic, because as we all know, the Europeans have tremendous economic power. In 2019, the State Department had me do a little 5-city tour in Germany, talking to them about China's military civil fusion policy. Hey, why is there such a large Chinese consulate in Munich? Oh, I don't know. Well, hey, Germans, you're awesome. I love you. You're amazing. But, there's some things more important than market access in China, right? There's some things more than selling products. And like if you're selling them stuff that they're going to use to kill Americans in 2028, I don't really love that. So can we be aligned on military civil fusion? Can we be aligned on sanctions and economic pressure? And let's approach the Beijing, the Middle Kingdom, unified, right? Imagine that, going back to the playground analogy, it's good to have friends. So let's unify with them where we can economics. Let's get squared away on military civil fusion. Let's make NATO as strong, as unified as possible so we can do more to deter the worst war of the 21st century in the first island chain.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. We are now going to go to questions from the audience. So please raise your hand if you're interested. Okay, I'm going to call right on the back.
Ma'am, you referred to the culture of certain European countries as being, counterproductive. And I was hoping you would elaborate on that.
This is a problem here in the United States. And I'm from Australia, where it is like an even bigger problem. Look, on our 250th anniversary last year, we honored Gordon Wood, historian Gordon Wood, at our Crystal Award, which is our big annual thing. And he gave a wonderful speech, and he called America a creedal nation. Right? We are a creedal nation. We are a nation that believes in something. We don't believe, we were all born, here and we all have the right blood. It's not a blood and soil belief. The problem for Europe is that Europe abandoned blood and soil at the end of World War II, thank goodness, after doing substantial damage, and the pendulum swung in so much, 180 degrees in the opposite direction. So much so that I've had European friends complain to me about the number of flags there are in America because it's so fascistic, right? Patriotism is not fascistic. National socialism is fascistic. So, the inability to see the difference between that and the willingness to believe that our values, when we talk, we sort of, bitch and moan about shared values. We still have more shared values between us than we do with, say, Saudi Arabia, communist China, Putin's Russia. But there is a growing gap. And the challenge here is, believing actually, our way is better. This is what I'm talking about. Women's rights are better. Religious freedom is better. Freedom of speech is better. Elections are better. Losing elections is better. Education in real history is better. All those things. And this is where there is, yes, a problem here, but an increasing and widening gap with Europe, where in Italy, you have schools that teach only in Chinese, schools that teach only in Arabic. What the hell? Right? That's what I'm talking about.
I have a question for Mr. Bowman. I was wondering if you could expand on the Russian threat to the Balkans, either from invasion or other means.
Balkans. You want to take that one? I don't look at Balkans much. So my colleague Ivana Strodner could give you a 3-hour response on that, but I probably can. So I'm not even going to try. But thanks for the question. You want to talk Baltics? I can, but Balkans. You got anything to say on the Balkans?
You've got the Serbians who are basically a patsy state for Putin at this stage. And China. He continues to meddle in Moldova, supporting the breakaway province there. So it is an issue. I think it's a far greater concern should a ceasefire be or any form of enduring peace agreement be reached with Russia and they reposition into the Western military districts, they will have an enormous fighting force now immediately positioned opposite the Baltics. And so that's where my main concern would be, is ensuring that we are properly postured to deter either further Russian adventurism on his own or, as increasingly possible, coordinated opportunistic aggression in the event of a Taiwan crisis with Putin reset and ready to move again.
But I think what you allude to and what we haven't talked about, which really is something that needs to be addressed and we don't have an answer to it, is, and very much visible in the Balkans, is Russian meddling, Russian and frankly Chinese meddling. One of my favorite factoids, tiny little anecdotes, is that when Iran turned off the internet, in order to continue to crush its population and murder its own people, almost all of the Scottish independence Twitter went silent. Like, oh, didn't know where that was coming from, but now we do.
And then I promise I'll do this.
Thank you, Christian Brick, Ambassador of Estonia to the US. I would like to thank the panel for the comments and the conversation. I come from a country of 5.4% of GDP spent for core defense this year. A country that is ranked number 3 in the world in terms of freedom of speech or media freedom. So we do take some of these things seriously. Now, when it comes to the future of alliance, some of you did mention the fact that that the current administration or maybe the president does not consider alliances as such something that has its value, that he and they see it differently. There's also another thing that I think is a huge challenge for the alliance. The fact that I would say increasing number of people in this town don't see Europe as the area of core interests for the United States. So my question to you is, what should European countries do? How can we bridge this gap if, in case you think that actually alliances do matter and Europe actually is an area of core interest for the United States still? Thank you.
I mean, a couple of things. First of all, Europe remains our largest trading partner. So it is, as an aggregate group of economies, it's very important to the United States. And so we should look to really continue to grow and bolster that trading relationship. When it comes to alliances, I would just recall you can't get to Article 5 if you haven't already read through Article 4 and the obligation to look to your own national defense needs. So if we want, and this administration's been very clear that, and this is a fair, I think it's a fair way to think about treaties. They are contracts. And when you have a contract with counterparties, you expect to get what you paid for. You expect to get what was agreed. And when you don't get what was agreed, you have every reason to be upset. and to look for ways to remedy the deficiencies on the counterparty's side. That's why I've suggested the reforms within NATO that I've suggested, because they are consequential and they would have significant effect on these countries that are not holding up their end of the contract without actually ripping up the entire contract itself.
I would just say my colleague Cameron McMillan and I published in Defense One where we made the following point, I think backed up by statistics and facts, that President Trump is out of line with majority opinion of Americans and majority opinion on Capitol Hill with respect to NATO, Europe, and Russia. If you look at the Reagan Institute, they actually have, they contract with someone to do a serious scholarly poll. Large majority of Americans are what I would call solid on NATO and Europe and see Russia and the Russian bear clearly, and large majorities of both parties on Capitol Hill still. So I think President Trump is out of step with Congress and he's out of step with the majority of Americans. We'll see whether he's done lasting damage to those views after his term is over. We'll see. I would say that as just as a fact. I take that as some source of hope that maybe we'll return to a more sane policy toward Europe, NATO, and Russia after his term is over. We'll see. But I would just, in the spirit of among friends, sir, admiring you live close to the Russian bear. You understand the Russian bear better than I ever could, and no wonder you spend so much on defense because you live next to the Russian bear. And I want to do everything we can to help you, and that is why it was a mistake for this administration to not fully fund the Baltic Security Initiative, and it's a mistake to withdraw 5,000 troops, part of a brigade combat team from Europe, which is a gift of Vladimir Putin. But to my European friends, I would say. Here in Washington, we agree on almost nothing these days in these hyper-partisan days, but what we generally do agree on, if you look at the polling, is that the CCP is bad. That's where the sky is blue and the CC is bad and everything else we can't agree. And so how's that relevant to you? I'd say the quickest way to further undermine American support for Europe is to be squishy on China. So my humble request to our allies and peers with whom I respect would be, please work with us to not be squishy on China, because you will empower those who want to say adios to Europe and to NATO if you're squishy on China. Thanks.
I just wanted to say, add one thing to footstep something that Brad said, which is about polling of the American people and specifically of Republicans. Polls that the Vandenberg Coalition has conducted starting in June of last year indicate that every month to month, we're seeing at least 75% of Trump voters saying that Russia is considered a major adversary of the United States and that we should do more to pressure Russia because of its aggression against Ukraine. So I think that sort of mirrors what we saw in the Reagan Institute poll and others. Okay, more questions. I'm going to go to this side. Okay, this gentleman right over there.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Sydney. I'll represent the side of the room. I want to invite you to take one step further on the constructive part of this panel. Reforms to NATO to basically employ stick against those not meeting their commitments, and basically war game one step further. The enemy gets a vote, right? So what is the likely next step? Either yes, roll over and congratulations, we meet 3.5%. We put pressure on the diplomatic and military establishment and the political establishment responded. Awesome. What's the negative scenario there? What is the non-compliant response of a NATO partner who suddenly faces punitive measures in return for not meeting treaty commitments?
Well, there's lots of options, and I want to be very clear here. You know, I'm a Trump guy. I served in his first administration. I support and I share his deep-seated frustration with Western Europe. I was there when Don Rumsfeld called out NATO, the NATO nations, for being deadbeats. I was there when Bill Gates did the same, and every subsequent Secretary of Defense and President. President Trump's New York style of negotiating is tonally different than the way that Leon Panetta, for instance, approached the same set of grievances that we have, legitimate grievances. But substantively, it's identical. And in contrast with all of those previous administrations that complained about Europe not doing enough, under President Trump, 1 and now 2, Europe is actually moving in the right direction. Whether it's out of fear or whether it's out of embarrassment or some combination of both, the intended effect is beneficial in the long run. Getting the nations not now to 2%, but to 3.5. We'll get to 3.5. I'm sure we will. And if we don't, then our ambassador will speak after, the Spanish.
1.5 trillion helps a lot with that.
If it rolls to baseline.
Yeah, right.
But there are plenty of other things that are now happening that I think will have long-term healthy consequences. So when we tell the Europeans they need to step up with their own defense industries, they're actually now beginning to do that. And so as you begin to see the Franco-German UK collaboration on precision deep strike capabilities, absolutely. I can tell you firsthand, the Russians are paranoid about our Army Typhoon weapon system. They're paranoid about intermediate range capabilities. So encouraging investment in the industrial base in Europe, even if it leads down the road, and it will, to competition with the United States industrial base, I think is an inherently good thing. But there are plenty of other things that we can do to penalize countries that we don't have to agree to reimburse Spain for the $800 million spent on Rota. Right? We can block that. Now, a lot of that is being spent to our advantage at that naval facility, but they're not guaranteed that money. So there are other steps that we can take within the alliance structure or outside the alliance structure. We do have excess troops in Western Europe. I don't favor bringing them back to the United States. I favor pushing them forward into Eastern Europe. But we need to recognize that there's a reason why we're at Rota, because it's right there at Gibraltar. There's a reason why we're at Aviano, because it's the only major airfield south of the Alps where we can position fighter jets. There's a reason why we're at Grafenwehr, because it's the largest live fire and mobility range in Europe, and it beats anything available anywhere else, including Poland. So there's a reason why we don't want to walk away from all of the aviation investments we made in Germany. Ramstein is crucial to us. It's where we medevac wounded soldiers from the Middle East. And so on and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of reasons why we need to stay connective. But a BCT, if it's moved east, I think that's fine. Bringing them home, I would rather not. Amen. Suspending the HIMARS and Typhoon deployments, I'd rather not. But again, Mertz shouldn't have said what he said.
And, there are Americans alive and with limbs and eyesight because of Landstuhl, right? I mean, just riffing on what you just said. I've agreed with everything you've said today, except for the part about substantively the same. So, just a few statistics. Non-U.S. NATO members, that's all of Europe and Canada, have increased their defense spending by 20% since 2024, collectively, 20%. And Europe and Canada added over $600 billion in defense spending since 2014. What happened in 2014? Yeah, Crimea, right? So Trump, you get some credit, you get some real serious credit, let's be fair, for increased NATO spending because you've scared the heck out of them, and so they've increased their defense spending. But who gets the most credit for NATO increased? It's Vladimir Putin because of 2014 and 2022. And I agree with you, and you have way more experience on this than I do. Secretaries of Defense going back how many? 4, 5, 6, 8 have said, Europeans, come on, man, you're free riding, step up, step up. That's not new. You mentioned Secretary Panetti, he's on our board of advisors. I totally agree. And tell me if you disagree with this, what is substantively different about what Donald Trump did is he threatened to not honor Article 5. I'm not aware of another president or Secretary of Defense who ever threatened to not honor Article 5 of Europeans' defense war. To me, that is absolutely substantively different, and it undercuts our deterrence because it creates the perceptions when Putin does a Crimea-style invasion of the Baltics that America will not be there, thereby increasing the chances it will happen. Am I wrong? What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong.
A single Secretary of Defense or President who's threatened to leave Article 5, not honor Article 5 if the U.S. if they didn't spend more on defense. Name one.
I think musing out loud about why we would, under what circumstances we would honor Article 5, is part of why the president's negotiating strategy, honestly, has been effective, and it's now also being effective with the Iranians who can't figure up from down at this stage. So it's been effective with Delcy Rodriguez, who has no idea what's coming next towards her in Venezuela. Again, I wore my shape tie here today.
Nice.
I think NATO is vital to our interests, but I think the end result of Europe writ large stepping up. I was there at NATO when we agreed to 2%. Everybody thinks 2% was agreed post-Crimea. Not true. We agreed to it at the Riga summit way back in, 2008, 2007?
Right.
And we agreed to it, and then nobody did it.
But when did European defense spending increase? It started increasing in 2015, and Donald Trump wasn't president yet. So it'd be wrong to say that he gets credit for that.
So some of the spending did increase, but certainly not enough. And it's after Trump really laid the hammer that we saw, holy cow, we did commit to 2%. We recommitted to 2%. Maybe we actually ought to get to like 1.8.
Well, with that, unfortunately, we are at time, and I really try to get people out of here when we say that we will. Thank you so much to our panelists for this really thoughtful discussion. I learned a ton from everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you learned a lot as well, and we hope that we see you all at future Vandenberg Coalition events. Thank you.